It was a very strange phenomenon, because the only other time that you found such a powerful messianic fervor going all through Klal Yisrael was in the time of Bar Kochva, when Rabbi Akiva said that he was Mashiach ben David. Since that time, whatever Mashiach there were always tremendously behesta. Suddenly there arose a man, chapter 3, who claimed, together with Nathan of Gaza, that he was Mashiach. But at that time, certain things happened which enabled it to really come into fruition. Chapter 3 and Nathan of Gaza were very great in Kabbalah. And what chapter 3 fundamentally said was an interesting thing. He basically clarified the concept of the Mashiach B'Klippas. This is what happened. He was a very great Mekubal, and he was able to explain certain basic things about the Mashiach, which most people did not know. Not only that, he was able to explain it with very strong consistencies in Kabbalah itself. And even very great Mekubalim seemed to fall prey to his particular theory. What happened? Fundamentally, what chapter 3 said was that the Mashiach is an individual who is the last climax, you see, of the Inyan of the Kedusha B'Tzorech HaKlippas. So therefore, the Mashiach, in order to do his job, has to go into the Klippa itself. And by going into the Klippa itself, would then be able to remove the Urus of that Klippa and restore the last of the Urus to Klal Yisrael itself. That's what chapter 3 said. Now, truth of the matter, there is an Inyan of that, like we've explained a great deal. That the whole Inyan of Mashiach, right before the Mashiach and so on and so forth, is that the Mashiach is B'Tzorech HaKlippas. There's no question about that. And that his avodah B'Tzorech HaKlippas is the avodah which is matzal or megala, which reveals and it redeems, it's further, the last of the Urus of Klal Yisrael. This is very true. But what chapter 3 says, he gave a certain twist on that pshat, which is somewhat different. He said that it's the avodah of the Mashiach to go into the Klippas consciously and voluntarily, you see. And this is a sheker v'chodov, you see. It's the Inyan of the Mashiach B'Tzorech HaKlippas is not a voluntary act. It's an involuntary act. The Mashiach is born in the Klippas. He's born in a sense and he can't get out of it, you see. It's part and parcel of him, like he's in prison. He no more wants to be in his Klippa, and he no more can get out of his Klippa than a person who's in a prison can get out of their prison. Not that he wants to enter it, chas v'sholom, because to enter in the klippa is to go into the tumah or to do a chet, right? With bechira. When you do a chet with bechira, then you become dovek to the tumah. You're not just mislabich in it, in terms of being imprisoned, you actually become attached to that. And that's chiluk, chapter 3 never bothered to explain. He took advantage, so therefore what happened was, chapter 3 promoted the idea that he and whoever follows him can actually begin to do chatoyim. And by doing chatoyim, it's the chet itself which would redeem Klal Yisrael, which is a total perversion of the whole Inyan itself, of the whole Inyan of Mashiach itself. In fact, later on, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who was about 40 years later, and he rose and became a Makubal, and he was persecuted because Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto began to be Megala, to understand the nimshal of this awe, of the Zohar and of the Kabbalah. But what happened is that he was put in Cherem, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, because of the Kabbalah that he knew, because of the previous damage that Shabtai Tzvi did with the Kabbalah. But Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote a sefer called Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos. And in the sefer Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos, he wrote the sefer to show us and to explain to us why the theory and the term of Shabtai Tzvi was a total sheker. And this is what he says. He writes in the Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos that the things I'm about to reveal in the Sefer about the Mashiach, it is also to reveal, it's not allowed to even think of. That's what he writes. What I'm about to write is so difficult and so high that you're not only you're not allowed to write it down, but it's also laharabah. You can't even think in these nyonim. But he said, what can I do? I must write this down to save Klal Yisrael from any future debacle or catastrophe which came on Klal Yisrael because of Shabtai Tzvi. So he clarified exactly what the Torah of Shabtai Tzvi is. And what he clarified is what I'm saying. You see, is that the Inyan of the Mashiach B'Tzorech HaKlippas is an involuntary Inyan. And it's something which causes immense suffering to the Mashiach as such. But it's not something that he, chas v'shalom, would want to enter in such a kind of thing. Where Shabtai Tzvi felt and he believed and he promoted the idea that therefore he had to go into the Klippa itself in order to be Mavara, the last of the earth. What happened? What happened was basically, after a while, after a year or so, and I won't go into the whole story of Shabtai Tzvi, he said that the actual final redemption, the case itself, will come in 1666. Why him and Nassim of Gaza actually said this, I don't know. Because it came that time and nothing happened. You see. And then shortly after that, there was a whole tumult that was made, and slowly after that, there were many people that began to arise and said that chapter 3 is a shakun, because he started doing all kinds of crazy things. He took a piece of chaza, and he ate it, and he made a bracha, mate asurim. You see, he would go to a shul, you see, and begin to do all kinds of crazy things. And there are many crazy things. There's things that mamash osaf malacha he do. In the guise and the fact that he said that he was Mashiach and then it was Muslim to do all these crazy things and so on. But slowly his reputation began to deteriorate. And then after a while he's reported to the Sultan of Turkey and he was arrested. And the Sultan finally said to him that the only way I'll let you get out and you can avoid the death penalty because you're promoting treason among my subjects. Because by saying you're Mashiach, you're trying to say that all the Jews now will leave my country and go back to Israel. So because of that, you're promoting treason and you're subject to death. So he said to chapter 3, the only way I'll let you get away with it is that you have to convert and become a Muslim. So what happened was, chapter 3 converted and became a Muslim. And this was a staggering blow, because how could the Mashiach convert to a different religion? But strangely enough, because of the fact that the awe of chapter 3 was such a powerful awe in a certain sense, there were many people that still believed it, and they explained it by saying that chapter 3 has to go into even deeper klipa to save Klal Yisrael, and so on. Until finally Shabbos finally died a couple of years later, and then after that most people saw that since he died obviously he was a nobody or nothing, but there still remained a cult of Shabbos long after he died, up to the 20th century. There was a cult in Turkey. I forget what they called. What? No, it was even further than that. But there was cults after that were based on that, and in the 1700s there was another cult called the Frankists, that held that in order to bring Mashiach, you have to do Chatoim. I mean, really became twisted and perverted. Why do I say all this? Because I would like to say the following thing. The truth of the matter is, the reason why chapter 3 was so much liach, and he was able to produce such a powerful situation, is because in certain ways he was riding on the awe of the Mashiach itself. Not that he was Mashiach, but he was riding on that awe. What do I mean? In the 1500s, it was obvious because of the Arich of the Golos of Edom, of Esav, that Klal was now Zeicha to the Orish of Mashiach. And it came down. It came down in the form of the Ari, and the special Gilus that happened. But even then, it was only allowed up to a certain point, and it had to develop. But by the 1630s and 1640s, that all had come down in the sense that it could be now Mefusim of Klal Yisrael. So Klal Yisrael, obviously in the 1640s or 1650s, was standing on the threshold of the Yemos Mashiach. And they were needed whether or not they would be zeicha to such a zach. But obviously Klal Yisrael failed. And because they failed, the whole inyan of the possibility of Mashiach, that's all, went over into the hands of the Klippa. And suddenly there arose a Mashiach who was totally tamei, in the sense that he was a Mashiach shel Sheka. And that was chapter 3. But chapter 3 was able to take a tremendous awe and pervert it and twist it, you see. But he had this koyach, because obviously that koyach was given to him because of the kittig of Klal Yisrael, who was zeicha to the old Mashiach at that point in time, you see. But he failed chapter 3, and because of that, the entire thing, obviously chapter 3 failed, and he was seen to be a shakman, and the entire thing went totally in the klipa. And because of the fact that it went in the klipa, later on, when Moshe Chaim Luzzatto came out with the Kinnis Hashem Tzvokos in all its form, even though he was an emetzer person, he already began to suffer. Him and the entire Chochmah of the Kabbalah established a certain pagam, or certain defect, you see. The reputation of the Kabbalah and so on, in a certain sense, was affected. Because people say, you see what happens when you study these Nyanim, when you study Kabbalah and all these Nyanim, you can chas v'shalom go off the derech, which chapter 3 did. So therefore people began to turn away from the Kabbalah and turn away from that entire awe, which is exactly what the Satan wanted. That's exactly what the Kippur did. Because of the fact that Klal Yisrael was not zeicha to the Yemos Mashiach and the awe of the Ari at that time, the entire situation came out in such a way where it caused a rejection of the inyan of the Kabbalah. So therefore Klal Yisrael would no longer want to become involved with that kind of inyan. So later on, about 30 years later in 1700, when the Ramchal, when Moshe Chaim Luzzatto appeared, he was already suspect because of that, and therefore what he produced was fundamentally the nimshal of the Kabbalah, which is the kernel of the entire thing. The awe which the Moshe Chaim Luzzatto brought down was greater than the awe of the Ari. Why? Because it's the nimshal, or the actual reference, in which the mashal of the Ari and the Zoya only refer to in symbols. You see. But that awe was so pure that Rav Moshe Chaim was brought down. In that sense, it was so pure that the world could not be zeicha to it. And there had to be a kitrug on that. And that kitrug was the extension of the whole catastrophe of Shas Tzvi. There is another simon, a very powerful simon, probably the most powerful simon of all, that the time of the Ari, and that entire Tekufa of the 15th and 16th century, which indicates that Klal Yisrael is actually Zercha to the Orish Mashiach, but lost it, and therefore achieved nothing more than a catastrophe in Shas Tzvi. What is that? That is the following. The main klipa of Klal Yisrael when they fail is Esav. You see, whenever Klal Yisrael is Zercha to the Yemoitz Mashiach or the Orish Mashiach and they fail, it goes in Esav. Witness the fact of the Churban Ma'asheni. Klal Yisrael was almost Zercha to the Orish Mashiach, they lost it, hence what happened? It went into Esav. How did it go into Esav? Christianity developed. But here's the Nekuda. Christianity is the awe of Kedusha, in a sense, in the Klippa, so that there's a total perversion of the entire message of Yiddishkeit itself. But there's a certain Nekuda of Kedusha itself. So therefore we see that when Klal Yisrael is no longer Zercha, the awe goes into the Klippa, or the representation of the Klippa in the Ummah that represents it, which in this case is Esav. You see. So obviously, whenever Klal Yisrael loses the awe, which is very powerful for the Orish Mashiach, we have to look at the Goyim or the Ummah Sa'olam or Esav and see what new thing happened over there, which in some way corresponds to the lost awe of Klal Yisrael. And the question remains, what happened in the Goyish Welt in the 15th and 16th century? This is the critical aspect. What happened in there? Can we find some kind of incredible revolution or incredible movement of some sort in the world of the Goyim, which had never happened before, which indicated the transfer of the lost awe of Klal Yisrael into that hand? If the world of the Yidden were not Zercha to the awe of the Ari and the awe of Kabbalah, obviously it went over into the hands of the Goyim in some way, and of course into the hands of the Tumah in the day Shas Tzvi. We've examined it in the Shas Tzvi and how he mamish came right after the Ari. But what happened in terms of the Ummah Sa'olam, in terms of the Goyim? Can we see some kind of event which parallels the descent of the Kedusha into the Tumah? I would say that the most fundamental transfer of that awe is indicated in the 1500s and in the 16th century in the guise of two individuals, Galileo Galilei and Sir Isaac Newton. Galileo was the first one that began to experiment and began to determine the laws of nature through experimentation. Galileo is the father of modern science in the sense of experimental science. He was the first one that began to use the vehicle of experimentation to really begin to understand the laws of nature. He lived in the 1500s at the same time as the Ari. And later on in the 1600s, when finally the Chochmah of the Ari was written down in the Kisvei Ari, Isaac Newton lived. In fact, Isaac Newton produced his greatest theories, the theory of gravitation, the calculus, and so on, and the laws of mechanics, all in the same time, in 1630s and 1640s, in that period. What Isaac Newton did was to solidify the scientific method itself, so that from then on, mankind will be able to begin to grow in scientific technology which they have never done before. It was Galileo and Isaac Newton who truly brought the whole England of science into the hands of man. And after those two, the scientific method was created, which allowed man to achieve all the chokhmah, all the science, and all the technology which we have today. Everything we have today is built on the fundamental methodology which they have created, they have discovered and presented to man, you see. And they lived at the exact same time as the Ari and the Kisvei Ari. And that's what happened. And from that time, the Goyim were never the same. The Goyim after Isaac Newton were never the same as before. Because the difference between civilization after Newton and Galileo and before was a difference of antiquity or medieval period to modern period. And everything we see today is an outgrowth of the scientific method of Galileo and Isaac Newton. This is what they did. But where did they get this awe? Where did they get this awe of such an incredible chokhmah, such an incredible ability to for the first time look at the internal essence of nature and begin to figure out what it is? Where did they get the ability to read the laws of nature, the laws of the world itself, to actually read it as if the book of nature was suddenly opened up and they can read it, you see, like a textbook in that kind of sense, and begin to reveal what was hidden to man for thousands of years and which man never knew? Where did they get that tzchus? They got that tzchus because of what Klal Yisrael lost. You see, the tremendous awe which Klal Yisrael had with the Ari and the beginning of the Kabbalah, the awe of the Zohar at that time, and the Chokhmah of the Pnimius, the Chokhmah of the what? Of the Hashkocha, in the form of the Moshel, and later on with the Ramchal, with the Nimshal, was lost and was given over to the Goyim, to Esav. And it came out in the form of Esav, in the form of the scientific view of nature itself, which changed all civilization. We saw once before this incredible transfer. In the Churban Beis Rishon, when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in 586 BCE, Klal Yisrael for the first time lost that Beis HaMikdash and the Shechina left. Well, when the Shechina left the first Beis HaMikdash, where did it go? It went deeper into the Klippas. That's obvious it is. If the Shechina went so powerful into the Klippa, obviously the all that Tferes and Oiz, the Tferes and Oiz, which should be Zercha, the Klal Yisrael, in terms of the Kedusha, went into the hands of the Goyim. What happened in the 6th century BC, in the 580s, or in that period of time, in the Goyish Welt, which corresponds to the enormous loss of Kedusha? In other words, since Klal Yisrael lost the Kedusha of the Shechina, they lost the Tferes and the Oiz that went along with that Kedusha. Where do we find a suddenly appearance of an Oiz and Tferes in the hands of the Goyim, which they never had before, in that time? In the same time that the Churban Beis HaMikdash was being destroyed, a new light was coming into the world of the Goyim, and that was called Greek philosophy. There was a man at that time that was born, and his name was Thales of Miletus, one of the Greek islands. He is called the father of science. He was the first one, him and his Talmidim, began to introduce the logical, rational approach to understanding the world. Before him, the world was dominated by mythology, by fiction, by folklore, by polytheism, by avodah zarah, by kishuv. It was at that time that the world for the first time began to look at reality from what? A rational, logical standpoint. And Thales went on, and his Talmidim were Pythagoras, whose Talmidim was Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The whole Chokhmas Yovim, where the Gemara says, Im Toimah is Torah b'goyim al tamim, Chokhmah b'goyim tamim. The Gemara itself says that the Goyim have Chokhmah. When the Goyim is referring to Chokhmah, when the Gemara is referring to Chokhmah, that the Goyim have Chokhmah, which Ummah is the Gemara referring to? Yovon, Greece. Greece is the nation that was given the awe of Chokhmah. Where did they get the awe of Chokhmah? They got that Chokhmah at the same time as the Churban Beis Rishon. When the Yidden lost the Tferes and the Oiz in the Beis Rishon, you see, which came along with the Kedusha they have, it went into the hands of the Goyim. Into which Klippa? Because the Klippa of Esav was not dominant at that time. Which Klippa, which nation represented the Sultan at that time to have that? Yavon, Greece. And Greece represented this particular awe itself. And that's when it went over. So we find that the two critical periods in history, when Klal Yisrael lost an immense awe, such an awe that's never been lost before, Oiz of Tferes of Chokhmah, into the hands of the Goyim, happened by the Churban Beis Rishon, with the ascendancy of Greek thought and Greek philosophy. You see, with the Churban Beis Sheni, with the ascendancy of the Roman religion, or Christianity as such, and finally with the ascendancy of the scientific revolution, which happened at the same time as the loss of the Oiris of Klal Yisrael in the time of the Ari, and in that time with the fourth Mashiach chapter 3. And that happened at the same time as the appearance of Newton and Galileo and the entire period of that time. We find the same transfer. And do not underestimate the power of the scientific revolution, because everything you see in front of you, in terms of the power of the Oiz and the tremendous Chokhmah of the Goyim, rests on the scientific revolution which is created by Galileo and Newton. That's what makes the Goyim be what they are today. And they have this koyach. Why? Because the Yidden were not zoicha to the tkufa, that awe, the beginning of the Mashiach in the 1500s, when they should have, because that time the koyach of Esav was going down because of the 1500 years of Golus that Klal Yisrael was sevil and suffered at their hands. So we therefore have to re-enter the klippa again of Esav and begin this thing itself. I'd like to discuss tonight an important topic. It's a topic I know I usually do not discuss, because for a number of reasons it is generally not necessary to most people, and for more important reason, it's very, very difficult for most people to handle. It's hard to handle. You have to have learned a great deal of hashkafa and developed very good sensitivity to many, many areas before I would discuss a topic like what I'm about to do tonight. Because like I said, you have to be at a very far distance to catch certain subtleties and nuances and basically the pneumius of what I'm saying. But I feel that you people are basically ready, and you've asked me to discuss some selected topics. So the thing that I want to discuss tonight is another of the major religions, basically Hinduism. Last time we spoke about Christianity, we spoke about some of its basic ideas, and more important, the hashkocha of where it fits into the hashkocha of the Bria. I would like to do tonight to the same thing to some extent with the discussion about Hinduism, specifically a branch of Hinduism called yoga. Now, the reason why I choose yoga, because yoga really in many ways is like the pneumius or the neshama to Hinduism, basically. And Hinduism has changed over the years. Hinduism is fundamentally practiced in the East, most basically in India, and there are certain offshoots that are certain similar. There are certain similars, namely Buddhism, and Buddhism has certain similarities, but it's somewhat different in that way. But the reason why I say that this is the neshama of Hinduism is because of certain interesting things. Basically, Avodah Zarah does not exist in the West as we know it. What do I mean? The Western civilization, or Western man, the religions of the Western civilization are fundamentally Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And according to Halacha, Christianity and Islam basically are not considered Avodah Zarah for Goyim. They've been somewhat purged in that way. But in the East, in the Orient, the religions of the Orient are definite Avodah Zarahs. So that Hinduism is basically a belief in a polytheistic system. It's a belief in many different gods. And I'm not going to go into the polytheistic system. There are certain main Hindu gods, and then there are many little ones. Almost every little locality has its own local deity, and so on. So it's an incredible pantheon of the many, many gods which they have in this way. This is Mamash Avodah Zarah. The chief of all the gods, of course, in Hinduism, in that sense, there's a chief and there's the highest. There would be a number. There's what's called Brahman, and then there's someone called Shiva. There's a number of different entities who are like the highest ones, and there's a lot of little local ones. Now, clearly, this is Avodah Zarah. You find the same thing in Buddhism. Buddhism did not start off as Avodah Zarah. It didn't. But it wound up to be Avodah Zarah. Because what happened was, Buddha, who was the fundamental Chocham of Buddhism, who started in the 6th century BCE, in the time of the Churban Bayis Rishon, that's when he started it. What happened was, after a while, he started a certain philosophy. Buddhism was essentially started, it was a philosophy and a certain practice. We'll get into that concept in a minute. The difference with the concept of religion in the East and the concept of religion in the West, or philosophy, it's a different concept. We'll examine that closely in a minute. But what happened after a while, he sets forth a certain series of techniques in which he believed that a person can develop a certain aliyah, a certain growth. And we'll discuss that next time with that. And basically, after a while, he began to be worshipped. They worshipped Buddha himself. Now, if Buddha himself would have known that, he would have been the first one to jump up and down and call them all shaitim. Because Buddha had no shaykhs to that kind of avodah zarah, as such. But of course, as it happened over the years, he became the revered saint, and from a revered saint, he became a god. And that's why in India, you see all over the place, huge statues of Buddha. And that's it. So Buddha corrupted itself into an avodah zarah. But originally, it was a much purer form. In its pure form, it was called Hinayana Buddhism. That's Buddhism in its pure form. And then it became an avodah zarah, and in that form, it's called Mahayana Buddhism. We're not going to discuss Buddhism today, but it's a very profound system. We're going to discuss Hinduism today. And Hinduism also is a very polytheistic religion. However, the neshama of Hinduism is not, in a sense, polytheistic. And there's something about it which seems to have a certain nikud of emes. And what I'd like to do is to examine that nikud of emes, which it possesses. First of all, to see what it is, number one, and if there is a nikud of emes in it, you see, to examine how does it relate with Yiddishkeit. What does Yiddishkeit have to say about it? Because it's so vastly different, you see. Since Molay Kol Kevoidoi. The Banishim is the Borei Hakol. The Banishim is the one who fundamentally created Hinduism and all these things. These all come from fundamentally from Hashkocha. Every nuance comes from this Hashkocha. And the question is what the Hashkocha of these things were, number one, and also structurally some of the concepts of Hinduism in terms of are they emes or not, and if they are emes, what is its shaykhs to Judaism itself. Now, there's a very important thing that you have to realize about the East and the West, and the whole difference in what's called philosophy. Western civilization is fundamentally based on a certain focus. The focus of Western civilization is the intellect. It's what's called to understand. To understand something logically, analytically, cognitively. It's the clear analysis, intellectual analysis of an item or a series of facts to understand fundamentally what the import or the significance of those facts are, what they mean, what they say about the world, and so on. To explain those facts, and so on. This is fundamental. Now this tradition, which is basically the intellect, comes from the Greeks. And the Greeks were the ones who basically started this kind of mode of attempting to understand the world through logical analysis and intellectual speculation. It started basically with the Greeks, and as I mentioned last time, it came from the certain Tiferes, which left Klal Yisrael and went into the Chachamim of the Greeks, Chochma Vayavim. We won't go on that today. The Greeks, like I say, promoted and initiated basically the critical attempt to understand the Bria through logical and intellectual analysis. And fundamentally from the Greek tradition, all science has come up. All science and technology of mankind today fundamentally comes from the intellectual, analytic tradition of the Greeks, except that it's based on a slightly different system. The problem with the Greeks is that the Greeks were concerned with analyzing something, or analyzing nature or the world, purely by speculation or by thinking, intellection, reasoning unto themselves, what's called deductive reasoning. They attempted to understand how things were, what nature was, how the world operated, by trying to draw certain conclusions and logically figuring out where those conclusions led. So therefore it was really an armchair kind of situation, where they would sit and they would try and figure out what the situation was. So if you would ask them, posing the question, if you would pose the question, if you would pose the question, if you have a heavier ball and a light ball, and you go on top of a building and you drop it, which one will reach the ground first? They would attempt to answer that by sitting in their chair and figuring it out intellectually. That's what they did. And they would say, well, of course the heavier ball would fall faster than the lighter one would reach the ground first. You see. So therefore what they discovered a technique called logical, they didn't discover the technique, but what they did was they developed the art of logic and of speculation, of reasoning to its highest form, and they applied this to the natural world to attempt to understand it. But essentially, they understood the natural world only in terms of logical analysis. They never bothered to get up and actually drop two such balls from a tower. This was finally done later on, 1600 years later on, by Galileo and Newton and so on, who began to say that, wait a minute, Francis Bacon, who said that, wait a minute, it is true that the way to understand the world, or the world itself, nature, is by analyzing it through logical processes. But you can't sit in your chair and figure out those things. You've got to take those logical processes and you've got to put the question to nature itself. You have to observe, you must measure, you see. You have to experiment. And by actually interacting with the phenomena of nature, you can begin to understand how the world works. You see. So basically, the scientific method really is an extension of the Greek method, but it's an active method which actually goes out and meets nature halfway. This is basically what Western civilization is. In the Western civilization, what you therefore see is something called philosophy. What is philosophy? Philosophy is the desire to answer certain questions about the nature of reality purely by sitting and thinking about them. You see, science objected to this process as far as nature is concerned. What science says, okay, you want to sit and you want to figure out the nature of God? Gesundheit. You want to figure out if there's a human soul? Gesundheit. But don't sit there and start figuring out about how reality actually works in terms of physical, biological, chemical phenomena. If you want to understand that, you have to go out to nature and meet it halfway. That's what science says. But they accepted the dominant force of logical thinking, you see, as the main mode. But that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is the desire to know reality by thinking about it. In the East, in India, in Southeast Asia, in all these countries, in Japan, so on and so forth, this notion of philosophy does not exist. Nobody there sits and thinks about the world as such. They don't do that. Philosophers, we know it. Instead, they only know one thing. They only know something called religion. What exactly is religion? Religion basically is a system of thought or a system of ideas put into practice. That's what religion is. Religion is philosophy activated, lamaisa. And that's what the East knows. In the East, it's not the intellect which is predominant. It is the experience or the intuition of man which is the fundamental force. In the East, they try to acquire not new ideas or new understanding, but new experience. A deeper understanding of reality by experiencing a more profound state of it. It's a different sugan, you see. And that's why the whole derech of the Eastern man is very different than the derech of Western man. Now, I won't go into the hashkocha of this. It's a very interesting hashkocha. Why the two accepted two different polarities, you see. Where one took the mind, and the other took the experience, in a sense, the lave, in a sense, as the key function of exploration or understanding. And that's very powerful to do with the hashkocha, and so on. But we won't go into that now. Rather, let's go into the aspect of the concept of religion in the East, which is one of experience, you see. And let's analyze one of the main religions of the East, which is Hinduism, and see. And then when we finish that, we'll go back to Yiddishkeit and see which mode dominates in Yiddishkeit, in Judaism. Is it the intellect? Is it the experience? What exactly is going on in Yiddishkeit? And we'll see very interesting things that Yiddishkeit fundamentally is really different in many ways than all of these ones. The fundamental neshama of Hinduism, of that entire belief, basically, is yoga, you see. And it's contained in many of their doctrines and so on, and it constitutes the fundamental avodah of the Hindus. That's why when you see many times these Hindu imports, when they come here, these gurus, and so on, Maharishi and all these different yoga, all these guys who come over from India and so on and so forth, all of them don't promote Hinduism. They promote yoga, and they promote this kind of understanding. Why? This is fundamental, the core of the Avodah. Now, what basically is this essential philosophy of yoga? What does it say, and what does it want to do? Okay, let's go into this now in more detail. Yoga fundamentally has different divisions of branches. The one that we're specifically concerned with, because it's the greatest of all the branches, and it gets to the panemius of it fastest. Well, there's another part, but it's called Raja Yoga, which is the highest form of yoga. It comes from the word Maharaja. You see, it's from the same thing, Raja, and I believe it comes from the same thing. Raja, I'm not a fucking Sanskrit and so on. But Raja Yoga. Now, what fundamentally yoga says is the following, which is a very, very strange thing. What it says is the following, is that all of us possesses a certain sense of awareness, and that awareness includes our sense of self. There's an I, right? Each person has a certain sense of himself, correct? What yoga says is that the sense of self that you all possess is not correct at all. You see, your very thinking, when you're thinking right now and you're listening to me with your own sense of your own awareness. What yoga says is that sense of awareness is incorrect, but that there exists another sense of self which is behind this one that you have, which none of you have ever experienced before. And what they say is that it is the object of the person, the tikkun of the person, or his shlemus, really. It's a bad word, shlemus is not a good word. The ultimate objective of a person in the world is to reach or to become conscious and aware of that more fundamental sense of self, not the one you all possess now. Now, what am I talking about? That's what yoga says, which is a very strange idea, because you will say to a yoga, what are you talking about? I am me. What I feel about myself is what I am. You know, what you see is what you get, basically. Is there more? A yoga will say, there is more. Yes, but there's another part of you behind your mind, so to speak, which is the real you see. Not only is there another part of you, but it's the real you, and what we see in front of us is fake, and it's artificial. That's what they say. What are they talking about in that sense? Okay, what they mean is the following. All of us have what's called awareness. or consciousness. We're aware. Fundamentally, we're all aware of ourselves. But consciousness manifests itself in different kinds of activities. Commentary. For example, we think, we have ideas, right? We feel, we have thought, we have feelings, we have sensations, we have will. In other words, our consciousness has different kinds of contents, and the mind or the awareness is occupied with different kinds of contents or aspects. Sometimes we have a feeling, we get angry, we become sad. Sometimes we have a thought. Many times we're preoccupied with sensation. We're involved in seeing something or hearing something. Sometimes we're involved with willing, wanting something, desiring something. You see? So therefore our mind or our awareness is involved with different kinds of activities. And these different things are different aspects of consciousness. We're aware of different things about us, you see. Now behind all these different activities of consciousness, where is the I? Where is the sense of self? Well, the answer is the sense of self is really engraved in each particular activity. As you're thinking, right, when you're thinking of an idea, as you're thinking of something, the thinking process itself contains the sense of yourself. As you think of your thoughts, at the same time you think of the one who's thinking, which is you. So you're aware not only of the thoughts that go in your mind, but you're aware of the individual who's thinking. As you're aware of a feeling, let's say you feel sad, when you experience that feeling, you also experience the person who's behind that feeling. Me. You see. As you experience a sensation, like a vision, like you see me, you also experience the person who is perceiving. Me. You see. In other words, the sense of I, or the sense of self, is felt, is made aware through the activities of mind. It is the activities of mind itself. Thinking, feeling, willing, sensing, all these various activities of mind, which has inscribed in each one the sense of I, the one who's doing each of these activities. So the awareness of self is not known purely, it's known through its activities. This is what yoga says. What yoga says is that there is a sense of I which transcends the feeling of self through the activities of mind, which no one has yet felt, at least in this room, and most of the world. But it is possible to become aware of self, pure and in and of itself, divested of all its connections to the activities of mind. So the object of yoga is to attempt to experience the sense of I, the sense of self, divested from mind, or from activity of mind. Now, that is the ultimate goal. So therefore, what yoga means, the word yoga really means, yoga means union. Union. And what fundamentally yoga tries to do is become unified with your own sense of self, which is behind mind. That's really what it is. Yoga has developed a series of techniques in which to do this. You see, this is not just a system of thinking. It's not a philosophy about the inner nature of man. For example, the Greek philosopher would sit and think whether man has a soul or not. Or they would think, what is the inner personality of a person, and so on and so forth. The Eastern people, the Hindus and so on, and the yogis are not concerned with that. They're concerned with finding it and lamaisa experiencing it. You see, not just figuring out if there is one. So what they've done is they've developed a series of techniques which attempt to actually allow a person to experience that self. Now, how do they go about doing it in that sense? Now, the number of techniques that they involve is called the Eightfold Path. And I have listed only 7 of these paths and so on. There are 8 madregas, or stages, in getting to it. And I'm going to go through these 8. And you're going to get the feel exactly of what's going on. How they do it. Okay. What are the 8 paths? Okay. The first one is called, fundamentally in Sanskrit, yamas, and there's another word, niyamas, which I didn't write down. I don't want to get into this. Fundamentally, what these things are basically midos of a person. Why? Because the yogas say the following. If you want to get down to the inner self, which is behind mind, you cannot have shaykhs with Elam Hazer. You can't. Because you can't spend your life energy being attracted or desirous of that which is outside of you. You see. In other words, the whole quest in yoga is to go inward, not outward. So therefore, what you have to do is preserve your energy so that you can go inward. So the first thing you must do is withdraw and disengage to as much as possible from Olam Hazeh. For example, you've got to work on, let's say many midas, but let's say we take 4 midas. First of all, violence. A person has to withdraw from the feeling of hate or violence. Because when you're violent, when you feel like violence or hate something, you're very much connected to the object outside in which you hate. In that way you spend a lot of energy. You see. It's bad. So therefore a person has to learn to tranquilize himself or calm himself and teach himself not to become angry and zikr, not to become violent. Greed. A person has to learn to curb his desire for wealth, for money, for objects, for possessions, so that he disengages from the objects in the world. Sensuality. A person has to disengage from taiva, from taivas noshim, from taivas achila, from lust for woman, for eating and so on. All these things, because obviously these things bind the man to the world itself, and they promote external, activity, and that's what we don't want. We want internal exploration and discovery, not external activity. And another thing, deception or lies. A person has to keep him away from sheker, because the ultimate thing is he wants to find the truth of himself. He wants to connect with true reality. Well, the way to connect with true reality fundamentally is to avoid falsifying reality. So therefore we find that the yogas promote very much the union of midas. You see, I'm talking about the true yogas. I'm not talking about the frauds. I'm talking about an elecha yoga, if I may use the term. Okay? If I use the term in a sense, it's concerned with being mashlim as midas. You see, and he's not mashlim as midas because why is he mashlim? He's not mashlim as midas because he wants to be, basically because he wants to adhere to a certain moral ethical system. No, these midas or yamas are very important. Why? Because what they do is they preserve and sustain life force for the work that has to be done inward. Once he's done that, once he's achieved a certain amount of discipline, which what we're talking about, self-discipline, we come on to the second madrega known as the asanas. This second madrega is the one that all Americans are familiar with, which is called hatha yoga, or all the funny postures that yogas get into. You see? All the exercises. That's what it is. The headstand and the lotus and so on, and the shoulder stand and what are the cobra? If you're familiar with all the different positions and postures and so on, these are technically called asanas or asanas and so on. What is the function of that? The function of that is that promote concentration. That when the person attempts to maintain a certain posture, you see, the physical activity of yoga is exactly the opposite than the physical activity of the West. In the West, the main physical activity is what's called either progressive resistance exercise, which is developing strong muscles by lifting greater and greater weights, number one. But that's a dynamic process, that's a movement of muscles. Or that's what's called aerobic exercises, which is involving producing a certain stress on the heart and lungs to make it more efficient, what's called cardiovascular reserve, you see. But in both cases, the exercises of the West are active, they're dynamic, you see. They produce what's called stress against the muscles and stress against the heart to promote a stronger system. In yoga, it's the fakir. They're not concerned with activity, they're concerned with passive posture, you see. The goal isn't to move, the goal is to stay still. It's to stand still. So what they do is they get into a certain posture, like the headstand, which is the difficult one, and they slowly get into that posture in a series of steps, and ultimately you reach that posture and you stay there for, let's say, 3 minutes. But as you stay there, you begin to concentrate on your body and the desire to get into that kind of posture. So you begin to promote certain kinds of Of concentration, number one. But also what it is it's very important to get into certain postures which are totally comfortable for the body. Because what the yogi wants to do is eventually get into his mind. But in order to get into his mind, you see, he first has to make sure that the body is not in a disturbed state. So he's got to find a certain kind of posture which is one of total comfort and doesn't require any movements, constant movements for adjustment. Now, what kind of state is that? And basically, what the yogis found out is that state is the lotus state, the half of full lotus. Do you ever see these yogis where they are, with the legs crossed and so on? I mean, in order to get to that stage, you've got to work for about half a year to get to it. It's a very difficult stage to get it. You have to be almost bow-legged or cross-legged or double-jointed to get into it and so on. But technically speaking, with all joking aside, is that when you get into that state and you sit with your legs crossed that way and you sit straight, in that sense, right, you are in the perfect state to begin the journey inward, the journey into the inner mind of concentration, you see. It is a perfect state. Once you achieve that state comfortably, the body will not move from that state. Whereas in others, even when you sit, you got to sit on another side or move here or stand up or something like that. And you can't do that. You can't go into the activity of concentration, inward concentration, when your body has to move. So the function of the asanas here is to promote certain kinds of postures which allow the body to go into a static, comfortable position that does not require readjustment. Okay? So that fundamentally a person could begin on the inward journey of concentration to unify with the ultimate self. Long sentence. Okay, that's the second step. The next step, which is what's called pranayama. Pranayama really refers to certain breathing exercises. What they basically say, yoga feel, is that the way a person breathes is many times in conjunction or is consistent with his emotional state. And you see, when you're angry or you're agitated, what happens? You start breathing faster. When you're happy, as we've been saying, the next step is pranayama, which concerns breathing exercises. The ultimate objective, like I've said, is to develop a breathing, a rhythmic, regular breathing pattern, which is not distressing. In other words, yogis have observed that certain emotional states produce certain patterns of breathing. You see, what they want to do is to have the chitzonius more the pneumius. In other words, by adopting a certain rhythmic, very regular breathing pattern, that will determine the emotional state. The other way around. And that's what they do. What fundamentally do, they have certain breathing exercises, all called pranayama, and the breathing exercises have to do with the nostrils. You breathe through one nostril, and then through the other nostril, through both nostrils, and in certain ratios. It's a whole chachma. That's really what it is, 1, 4, 6, it's a whole chachma in that kind of sense. It's a very big chachma in yoga. So that what you do is you promote the perfect breathing rhythm, which is then conducive, just like the asana, the lotus, the position of the lotus is totally conducive to rest and passive state. There are certain breathing rhythms which become totally conducive, right, to the ability, again, to promote the inward journey into the inner mind, you see. So once we've achieved the asanas and the pranayama, we are now ready to begin to go inward. Now we've finished the body and the breathing activity. The next state was called pratyahara. And what that state is the following. Fundamentally, one of the things that a person is totally occupied with is sensation. Right? He sees things constantly, he hears things, noises, sights, images, and so on. So, fundamentally, the ordinary mind, and let's call the mind itself, the ordinary mind, which is the mind with a sense of self engraved in all mental activity, which is what it is predominantly concerned with sensation. That's the main activity. Or many times, a thought jumps in, a feeling jumps in, but fundamentally, the one particular mental activity which is almost always there is sensation, unless we're asleep. So what pratyahara attempts to do, and I'm not clear on its techniques, I'm not clear on the technique, is to withdraw and disengage from sensation in a certain way, by sensing, but in a certain sense, cutting off the awareness of that sensation, so that it's like looking at something in almost like without really noticing what you're seeing, in a sense, you understand? It's like looking at, like just looking because you're looking, but in some way without the mind connecting to the image.
You do that when you're daydreaming.
And what they want to do is they want to shut off the mental recognition of sensation and in some way allow sensation without any mental involvement, like daydreaming, in some sense. How they go about doing that, I'm not clear. Once they've established to some degree the withdrawal from sensation, now starts the main thing. What the entire purpose now is to still the ordinary mind. See, what the big problem with mind is that the consciousness is always occupied or active in some way, with a thought, a feeling, or a sensation, and so on. The object is to withdraw to some degree from sensation, but also to still the mind. so that it focuses only on one thing and it does nothing else. So what the person does is concentrate on an object. He sits in the lotus position with the breathing regularity, and he concentrates or fixes himself on a specific object, whatever that is. And he concentrates on the image of that object. But he concentrates on the image of the object so that his awareness is only of the image of the object. He is not allowed to think, or he's not allowed to feel, nothing. No other mental activity is supposed to invade the mind. He's simply supposed to be only involved in the awareness of that object. Now that's very difficult. Yeah, well no, in a second. That's very difficult. And the first stage is called dharana, which is an interrupted fixation. It's a state where a person fixates on an object and concentrates on it, but every once in a while a thought comes in, he starts thinking about the job or this or that, a feeling comes in, he starts remembering things and so on, which means that his mind is not purged or clear yet. And it takes a while to do that. It takes consistent practice. But eventually he reaches a state called dhyana, which allows him the ability, and it's an extraordinary thing, to still the ordinary mind. So that the mind, even though there's a manifestation of mind, in other words, he's still aware of himself through a certain kind of mental activity, but he's limited those mental activities down to one activity. And he restricts it and holds it to that one activity and blocks out all others. You see what I'm saying? You see, in other words, the progress or the road to get to the self or the I behind the mind, in order to get that, you first have to in some way still the mind. You slowly withdraw. You withdraw first of all by withdrawing from sensation, and then what you do is you still the mind, and once you still the mind and you key in on one type of activity, then you make the leap back behind. That's the logic, and it's a clear logic. It's a very simple basic thing. The next step is finally called samadhi. What is samadhi? Samadhi is that leap. Now, how does that leap take place? Apparently, at this step, which is really the seventh step, a dhyana, the person sits there and he concentrates on an object without thinking or feeling anything else. He literally has reached the madrega of uninterrupted fixation or concentration. Now you have to remember, this is not a word, this is an actual state of mind. And it's something which none of us in this room have ever experienced. None of us in this room has ever experienced something called dhyana. No one. And when I say an experience, it is something which is beyond anything you've experienced. What the mind is like, what the experience of a person is like, what the kind of awareness is like, which is restricted to one activity without ever going on to another, is beyond any of our experience. And it is truly a level of deep meditation, you see. It is a very deep, profound level. It is a whole different sense of self, obviously. Because all ourself, we have a sense of self, right? As it manifests itself through constant mental activity. That's how we have that sense. Our sense of self is expressed in constant mental activity. But what is the sense of self expressed? What does it feel like? The sense of self when it's expressed in only one mental activity without shifting to others. You see? That's the step. And that's the last step behind the sense of self that is not involved in any activity. You see? The last stage, which is finally the eighth stage, which is the sense of self, which is not involved in any activity, but it's an awareness of self behind ordinary mind. After ordinary mind has been stilled and quieted, it's called samadhi. Normally what we do is we experience ourselves by experiencing the world, you see, by experiencing all other kinds of mental activities. But it is possible to experience self without experiencing the world. And in that case, it's an experience of pure I. Now, what does that feel like? We will just talk about that next. I'm going to tell you what that feels like. You see, we won't leave it at that. But I first want you to understand how you get there. You see, when you reach samadhi, now I don't clearly understand or know how dhyana shifts into samadhi. In other words, from the point of self, of awareness of the self behind one activity without others, to the jump, you see, where suddenly you abstract or you strip off the self from that activity itself. So now you're totally aware of pure self itself without a mental activity. I don't know how that jump is made. But there comes a point when it is made. And I think we can understand it when I bring another mashal. The yogas give a very interesting mashal to explain this entire process. When you look at a pool or a lake, right? And the lake is very still, correct? And you look into the water, you can see the bottom of the lake. Well, at least at a certain point. you see. But if you drop a stone and there are ripples, and you look into the lake, you can't see anything. That's exactly the same thing. The lake in this case is compared to the mind. As long as the mind is active, constantly active in mental activities of thinking, feeling, willing, sensing, you see, it is impossible to feel the I or the sense of self behind those activities. So what you must do is quiet the lake, you see, and produce a clear thing, and then you can see through it. You suddenly can begin to feel that self which is behind these various mental activities and behind ordinary mind. That state is called samadhi. Now, what is that state like when you get to it? What does it mean to experience pure self? Okay? This is what the yogas say. What happens when you do it? One, there's a feeling of incredible peace. What do I mean by incredible peace? Peace means a feeling of total absence of any stress, tension, or conflict. Why? The answer is obvious. Because when you experience self beyond mind, then you experience a sense of self which is beyond that which is in the body. You're experiencing self beyond feelings, or beyond thoughts, or beyond your body. It's a sense of self beyond the self as you know it through the experience of body and feelings. So therefore, since it's beyond that, it's devoid of any tension or stress whatsoever. So when you unify that, you're feeling an aspect of self which is a total peace. Now, what does it mean, a sense of self totally at peace? It's impossible to describe because no one, at least over here, has ever experienced that. But from what I understand and so on, the way to describe it, it's literally, it's a state of a total absence of tension. 100%. A total absence of conflict. So that the person feels total peace. That brings a state of immense ecstasy. It's also an ecstatic experience. There's a sense of joy or simcha that comes with that at the same time. There's another thing that you experience in samadhi, which is called union. And this is a very, very important thing. When we experience the sense of self into our ordinary mind, we clearly distinguish ourselves from everything else. Right? There's what's called the individual self, the individual I. I know myself very differently than I know each one of you. I have my own sense of self. It's separate from everything else. So the sense of self which is experienced in normal mind, ordinary mind, is individuated. But when the person reaches samadhi and he experiences the sense of self behind ordinary mind, he feels an incredible union with everything in creation. He feels the fundamental pulsating force, and he feels an achdus, a sense of self that pervades all reality. He feels a connection with everything in all creation, as if he's all part of one incredible force, or one incredible being. That's called, in the literature, many times in what's called mystical, occult literature, he experiences what's called a sense of what's called universal or cosmic consciousness. Now, again, you'll have to understand what I'm saying, because you don't feel. What it is, it's a feeling, is that when you feel the self at that level, you suddenly merge with the entire Bria. You feel, literally, an achdus, or a sense of unity to everything in creation, as if there's a connection between you and the table, or table, and all people, that there's something which somehow is miyachid, everything in the Bria, you see, as one basic entity. That's called the state of cosmic consciousness or universal consciousness. And therefore it's called, and it's an establishment of a union in that way. There's another characteristic to the state of samadhi, and it's a very strange characteristic. It's not only a feeling of unifying with everything in existence, in that sense, in all existence itself, but it's a way of unifying so that you feel a certain fundamental force. It's like a certain basic force behind all reality. It's the pulsating force of all reality itself. It's like you suddenly feel and sense the energy of all existence in your sense of self, you see. And finally, the last state, which is a very unusual state, and that's what they say, is that when you reach that state, you actually hear a certain sound. And that sound is a humming sound in this way. Om. That's the sound. It's like a rhythmic sound that you feel that's connected with this energy. And that's supposed to be, what they say is a universal sound. That's what it is. It's a universal vibratory sound which comes out as you experience itself. These are the characteristics of what it's like when you reach samadhi. Now obviously, the realization of samadhi, or the realization of that sense of self, is totally different than the way we experience ourselves in normal day life. And it represents a very high, very powerful state of peace, of simcha, and a very powerful state of unification. It's obviously a very high state of consciousness, far beyond anything which we normally experience in our regular lives. But of course, it can only be achieved in a certain way, through these basic steps. Let me explain what the sound Om is. This Om is not a sound. It's not a sound in the humming sense, like an audio signal. It's not that. What it rather is, it's an awareness of a vibratory energy of some sort, which has the equivalent of the sound of a hum, you see. But it's not an actual sound as such, you see. Obviously, it's very difficult to describe because it's an experience. It's an experience. It's an experience which is beyond normal sound as such. But it's a sound which is associated with the pneumius of the self in itself in terms of its characteristics. The question that we have to ask, which is a fundamental question, is this real? Is this true? That's what we must ask. And I can give you what I believe to be the answer. I believe that this is 100% true. For a number of reasons. There are a number of reasons why I believe that this is mamash emes, and that such a state called samadhi does exist, even though no one in the West fundamentally has experienced that, and it has no shaykh Yiddishkeit or any of these things. But I believe it is true. Why? For several reasons. When they describe the state, it is a state that I personally have never experienced, although I would like to. But I personally have never experienced this state, you see. But I do know someone who has, number one. But more fundamentally, what's very critical is in this characteristic called union. This characteristic called union, which is the most interesting thing of all. Why? I don't know if any of you know what the word occult means, or the occult sciences. The occult refers to all those chachmas that have to do with supernatural events. That's what the occult means. Like extrasensory perceptions, but all these things have to do with the supernatural are called occult. And there are many occult studies or disciplines. Many occult. Witchcraft is one. There's Freemasonry. There are many different kinds of occult studies. The funny thing is when you read about these different occult things, and to know what's true or not is one thing. A lot of them, of course, most of them have tremendous sheker in them. But there's one thing that they all say, and one thing they all say is exactly the same among all of them. And the funny thing is that sheker is something which has no common denominator with another sheker. Because by definition, sheker is totally individuated. Each sheker is for zich, it's its own. But when you see a number of systems that have an incredible common denominator, in a certain way, you begin to suspect that there could be an emes and so on. And the one thing which exists in all occult sciences, in all the occult chachmas, is the notion of what's called universal consciousness, or cosmic consciousness. What does that mean? They all describe a certain kind of existential state, a certain kind of experience, which is very different than ordinary human experience. And this experience is such that when a person reaches it, he actually feels a tremendous achdus with all existence itself. But it's a kind of feeling where it's not a thought, it's not a machshava, it's not a concept that we all share the property called existence. It's not that, you see. But it's a real feeling, and it's a feeling that when a person has these other qualities of a tremendous shlemus, or a certain peace, a certain joy and so on. And they all seem to describe it, even they all have different kinds of modes. Now what I personally feel, and what I've understood from all these things, is that each of these areas have a tremendous amount of sheker. But there is a certain vestige or a certain nukuda of emes, which they all share, in that sense, and then somehow they are all describing a certain state, you see, which is attainable and which has been attained. Although many of these various different occult situations, disciplines, may not be able to reach it, you see. So therefore, because of this, I personally believe that the system outlined here and the ultimate goal called samadhi is a truly attainable state. But it's a state which is very difficult to achieve and it's beyond the reach of most men. That's number one. Number two, my feeling tells me, my intuition, from what I know, is that there are many Hindis, yogas, who have reached it. How do I know that? There are certain ways to know it. There are certain ways to know. And it has to do with a knowledge of Yahadus and Avoid itself. The way the yogis talk about Samadhi, and the way you can see that it's real. Why? Why do I say? Because when you talk about concepts, you listen to what a person has to say and you see how he describes it. But if you want to know if a person has actually experienced something, right, then you listen very clearly to his description. Now, let's say, for example, there's a certain kind of experience. Let's see, for example, a roller coaster. I don't know how many people have been on a roller coaster and so on, but let's take the experience of being on a roller coaster in Coney Island, which is a certain kind of experience. It's a certain kind of experience, you see. And let's say you've gone on a roller coaster, one of the worst ones around. I mean, whatever they have, the second one, one of the really the toughest ones to carry through. And you go to a person and you say, have you ever been on a roller coaster? And he says, yes, I have, you see. Now, being on a roller coaster is an experience, you see. So you say to him, describe it to me. Now, if you've been on a roller coaster ride and you listen to what he's saying, you can tell if he's telling you the truth or not, you see. How do you know? Because when you're on a roller coaster ride, there are certain experiential events which occur, you see, which bring out a certain kind of descriptive phrases. And you know that when a person tells you about his experience, whether or not he's telling you the truth or not, you see. Because you can see how exactly he's describing that experience. You can see not only if he's describing the experience from an intellectual standpoint of what it would feel like to be on a roller coaster ride, you see, and what it would be like to actually be on one. You can distinguish it. Now, there are many other experiences which are even more subtle. The way they describe this in their books, and by the great Chachamim among them, the way they describe them, to me, clearly indicates that there is such a state and they've reached it. Why? Because they use the language of the Pnimius. Experience has a certain terminology. An experience of a Pnimiustic event has a very special kind of terminology which experiences of Chatzonistic events does not have. You see, that's the way it is. For example, let's say you have two tzaddikim, you see, or two kedoshim, two Baalei Ruach HaKodesh, and one person talks to the other, and one says to the other, I've experienced Ruach HaKodesh, you see. But let's say neither of them have the ability to know whether they each experienced Ruach HaKodesh, because neither of them can use this Ruach HaKodesh to know about the other one. Okay, so one of them says to the other tzaddik, have you ever experienced Ruach HaKodesh? Let's assume hypothetically of such a discussion. So the other one says, yes, I have experienced Ruach HaKodesh. So the first one says, let's see who has, he says, describe me what that is like. He can very quickly see if that other person has experienced it. Why? Because Ruach HaKodesh is obviously an experience which is beyond normal frame of experience, you see. And it's a kind of experience which is an experience of a deep pnimius. And because of that, it has its own descriptive phrases, its own terminology, which only applies to the experience of Ruach HaKodesh, or to the experience of pneumistic events, like Nevi'us, or so on and so forth. Even the Vekas has its own description. You see, a person who's experienced the Vekas always knows if another person has done. Why? Because he knows the description. Not that he knows the look, and he knows the description, and he knows what it sounds like in that sense. You can't fool the guy in that sense. Why? Because the Vekas, Ruach HaKodesh, all these madrigas are pneumistic or internal experiences which have their own description and their own way of understanding, you see. The way these people describe Samadhi, the way yogas describe Samadhi, I feel, if you're knowledgeable about the descriptive terms used in pneumistic experiences, you would see that their description of Samadhi shows that it is a real experience because they have the proper terminology. They hit it on the head. That's the reason why I believe what they're saying is true. And I can't be ma'arach on this. For me to be ma'arach on this is to go into a whole field of the concept of a pneumistic experience, the peculiar descriptive phrases that are used and so on. We will get some grasp at the end of today. Well, at least at the end of the subject, in that sense. But the way they describe it shows that it is a real internal experience. You see. So coupled with that fact, and the fact that they use the same terminology in many of their occult subjects and so on, and the way they describe it shows me, personally, that what they're saying is true. You see. Now, is there another way to reach this? And the truth of the matter, there is. I was once talking to a certain individual, a certain person, who described to me a certain experience that he had, which mamish fall along these lines, except that he had no shaykhs to yoga. And he told me the following. And the interesting thing is that I experienced this slightly myself, in a certain way, but not exactly this way. But I experienced myself a shtick on the way, although I didn't proceed further. Let me describe what it is, and it's something which all of you can actually experience. Let me describe what I mean. I was speaking to a specific individual, and I will not mention names, who was describing to me a freak event that happened to him. And what he was saying was the following, that he was once lying on bed and he was falling asleep. And he was like in the twilight zone, or before falling asleep. And as he was in the twilight zone, what he said was that he felt incredibly relaxed, very relaxed. And before he actually fell asleep, he was thinking, and he imagined himself sitting on a chair, you see. And suddenly, he imagined the chair flipping backwards, revolving on itself. And as it was revolving faster and faster, a very strange thing happened, you see. Suddenly, he felt a very unusual thing. He felt himself slowly disengaging from his body, in the sense that he was no longer sensed, his limbs, whatsoever. And he felt himself such that he could not feel his body anymore. He was lying there, and he was conscious, but he didn't feel his limbs, and he couldn't move his body at all. He could not move his arm. He didn't even feel his arm. He only sensed himself, you see. And what he described was that he sensed himself, the eye, as if it was focused purely in his head. Now what do I mean? When you lie down on the bed, for example, and you're lying there, and you close your eyes, you can sense any part of your body. True? You can sense your foot, your right foot. You can even sense your left toe, let's say, right? You sense it. You can sense it. Because the mind is such that it can sense every aspect of the body, you see. But what happens is, if you promote greater and greater degrees of relaxation, slowly, so that the body becomes heavier and heavier, after a while, if you do it correctly enough, what happens is, you will possibly reach a state where you no longer feel the body. The body is so relaxed in such a sense, and the concentration is such that the entire sense of I, or sense of self, is no longer distributed in the entire body, but it exists as a point in the head. It is possible to reach a point. In other words, what it is, you experience yourself, and you know yourself, but you don't experience the feelings or the sensations of your body at all. Except you experience yourself as if you're contained in a point in the middle of your head. You see. Now he told me that when he hit that state, he was like shocked for a second, because he couldn't move his body. He couldn't will any limb to move. And slowly what happened was, he was able to begin to shift that sense of self away from the center of the head toward the side of the head. Now that sounds very strange, you see. He said that as soon as he began to do that, a very strange thing happened, which was almost mind-boggling. He felt an incredible sense of peace. He said, such as not shaykh to describe in human terms. It's beyond imagining what it is. It's not even, when you say it's the absence of tension, that is a poor way to describe it. And with that sense of peace, is like a tremendous sense of joy. In that sense, he felt himself connected with all existence through that self, and he heard a very peculiar vibration. And which is an extraordinary thing. He actually experienced everything they did in a couple of minutes, with only take through some freak accident. That's exactly what happened, and so on. And that what happened is that he got frightened, because he realized that there was a very strange experience, and he was very frightened, and what he wanted to do was kind of get back to himself. So he couldn't move any of his arms or legs. So eventually what he did was, he was able to, by tremendous will and effort, to slowly begin to go back into his body, or sense his entire body. And as he did that, he got up. You see, he was never again able to repeat that experience. It was a freak thing. Now the interesting thing is, another thing is that I alone once experienced something not on that vein, but a very thing also, where I was sitting down, I wasn't lying on a bed, I was sitting on a chair, and I was very tired, and I put my head down, you see, to fall asleep. But I wasn't able to fall asleep so easily, and it wasn't easy, and I didn't want to fall asleep. I didn't want to, but I was extremely tired. So what happened was, I somehow got into a state of a twilight zone between sleeping and wake. In other words, I was aware, yet, in a certain sense, I wasn't fully aware, you see. And a very strange thing I experienced personally happened, is that I was lying there with my hands in front of me and my head on my hands, and I couldn't move any part of my body. Literally, I felt my sense of self. I knew that I was there, you see. I knew I was there, but I didn't see any other reality because my eyes were closed, but I didn't feel my body. I just felt like an overall presence. But I could not locate any part of my body, literally, and I couldn't move, and I became very frightened. I got claustrophobic anxiety, like you're locked into a chest, and so on. And this is what happened. But so instead of remaining in that state and attempting to go forward, the fear instantly projected me backwards. So I started, in that sense, to move. I couldn't move any part of my body, literally. I couldn't get up. It wasn't a state where you're sleeping. It's like a semi-state and so on. So what I attempted to do is to move my small pinky. Just to move that. And I had to exert enormous will for a short period of time until finally I felt it slightly moving. And then as it moving, I felt the sensation return, and then finally I was able to get up. But I have never experienced that before because it was almost like I was paralyzed. It was like I was fully conscious, but my body was in a state of paralysis, as such. Now, I didn't experience anything else, personally. I didn't. But I did experience what's called the disengaged self, or the dissociated self from the body. Although I probably was maybe a couple of inches away from going further. But I was too frightened, so I pushed back also. But I saw from that a most incredible thing. Because I saw that the concept of feeling self beyond body, you see, and even almost beyond mind, is possible. And I myself actually experienced that. Now, yogis do this scientifically, or they do it systematically. So because of that, since they do it systematically, they don't have any fears of going back. They do it in a way where they can go out to the end without experiencing any type of fear at all. But the truth of the matter is, you see, on the basis of all these things, I believe very clearly that there is such an experience called samadhi. I personally believe that everyone in this room goes through that state. However, what happens is that when a person falls asleep, the fraction of a second before the person falls asleep, that sense of self is that state. Except that the movement or the progression from wake to sleep is so rapid that it's quickly snowed over. You go right from wake into sleep. You see what I'm saying? But if it were possible to stop that movement in slow motion, you see, and progressively watch the sense of I, or the sense of self, slowly recede, you see, well, what happened is, right before the point of departure, right before the point of sleep itself, you reach this kind of a state. But the thing is, you've got to hold it and stay there, and stay on that plane. Now, of course, we can't do that, because all we can do is stay awake or fall asleep. We can't do what's called stop motion photography. You know what I mean? We can only run a movie one way or the other, one back and forth. We can't stop it. You see, we don't have that. But if you can run stop motion, sense of self, as you're going to sleep at a certain point, you probably can duplicate that, which is exactly fundamentally what I believe what happened with myself in that way. Let me just say one more thing about samadhi, which is a very interesting thing, which I do not understand totally. But samadhi itself is divided into several different categories. What do I mean? They say that fundamentally the samadhi is divided into at least two different levels itself. How? You can experience the inner self behind ordinary mind and achieve all these things, yet the experience of that kind of self is such that you know that you're experiencing that self. In other words, there's still a piece of self left from ordinary mind which knows that it's in contact with this other self. You see, it's like an iceberg where 90% of it is underwater and 10% is over. You see. So in other words, you feel this inner state, this tremendous sense of self behind mind, but there's a piece of mind which allows you to know that you felt that. But there's another madrega of samadhi, even deeper, which means that, and I don't understand the level of this experience, is when total self of ordinary mind is divested, and what happens is the person totally merges with that inner self. What the nature of that experience is, I have no idea, because I don't know. I don't know what the nature of that experience is, because it sounds like, in a sense, a contradiction. in a sense. I don't clearly know. Obviously what it is it's a totality of absorption into the inner mind behind the entire conscious activity of man as such, where he becomes one with that totality. What type of consciousness that is or experience, I don't know. But that's the highest madrega of samadhi. There's a critical idea which really has to be understood. There is no fundamental necessity for an individual to study these jnanam. You see, basically. And I want to make that very clear. The fact that I'm talking about yoga or Christianity or all these other things does not mean that a person therefore has to go out and study these jnanam and do a comparative analysis. It doesn't mean that at all. Not only one, that's number one. Number two, would be dangerous to even go out and study these other jnanam. Because if you are not properly prepared, or if you don't have a very good klorkeit in Yiddishkeit itself, in Hashkof itself, you will find it almost impossible to really understand these other nyonim. And you can chas v'shalom be toyer. And to be toyer in these nyonim is very dangerous, because they all borrow on Avodah Zarah. Not in these nyonim, yoga is not Avodah Zarah, but you can fall in to certain nekudas that have that. Hinduism is Avodah Zarah, but not yoga. But you have to be very careful. We discussed it tonight because we have already discussed in all of our shurim many inyanim. We've had shurim for a year and a half, and we've discussed a great deal of hashkafa. So I felt that the Olam is capable of handling this information. In addition, the Olam has asked me to talk about this, so this has been one of my incentives. There's one other critical point which has to be understood. It's not enough to draw a comparison between other religions and Judaism and Yiddishkeit, yoga, whatever have you. It's not enough. Christianity, Yiddishkeit, and so on. What's more fundamental, and is what I've done in Christianity, which I will do in yoga, is to understand the hashkocha in the bria. Why is it that certain ummas olam have developed this particular chokhmah or this particular tzugam? This is the inyan. This is the much deeper aspect. Not only enough to understand the contrast between the two. If there is an emes in yoga, if there's not an emes in yoga, whatever the story is, but more fundamentally, what is the inyan? What is the relationship of the Ummah Olam in terms of these various disciplines, in terms of their own tikkun, and why is it that the Banisham gave them this ha'ora? And of course, this ha'ora is from the Banisham, just like every ha'ora is from the Banisham. That why is it that he allowed this to develop and gave the koyach for the Ummah Olam to develop this itself? Where does this fit into the hashkoch itself, in terms of the tikkun of the bria itself? This is really the fundamental question. And when you look at it that way, you will begin to understand a very important thing. Everything which happens in the world, every historical event, whether it's an economical event, political, whatever event occurs in the world, subscribes to the inyanim of hashkocha, which have to do with the inyanim of the tikkunim. Because of that, since Klal Yisrael itself is the mamuna, or is a specific representative of the tikkun of the bria itself, everything around it in some way interfaces with the tikkun of Klal Yisrael itself. And when I say it interacts with it or interfaces with it, it means that there's a contrast or a hemshech of these other nyonim vis-a-vis Yiddishkeit. This is very important to understand, that especially in a time like this, when a great deal of the emes is no longer with Klal Yisrael, where there's a great deal of what's called first Biyat Sor, when a great deal of kedusha and emes of that kedusha no longer lies with Yidden, but it lies with the Ummah Olam, with Esav, we will find a great deal of emes in many of these inyanim, you see. And it's important to understand what this emes is, to see the contrast, and number two, to understand when it actually went over to the Ummah Olam, and why this specific chokhmah went over and not another. This itself is a whole chokhmah into itself. I'd like to discuss the aspect today of the relationship between yoga and Yiddishkeit. What is the relationship, number one? And number two, what can we understand about this entire chokhmah, mitzad hashkocha? Where does it come from? What aspect of inyan is it of, and so on? What can we understand this? This is basically, naturally, my understanding of it. This is not written in any psalm, for obvious reasons. So, fundamentally, it's something which I understand and which I believe may be true, and I'd like to propose this in that sense, but like I say, this is not, I've never seen this in any particular sefer as such, so it's not something that I'm going to support with. The Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in the Derech Hashem says a very interesting thing when he talks about what is a person. What is a person as such? What is the person in terms of his consciousness, his awareness, his feelings? Where does this come from? And what is the relationship between the consciousness or the awarenesses of a person and his neshama? What is the connection of the two? So the Ramchal says basically a certain Indian, which when I'm a Marech, because to be Marech to go into it's Marech into an Indian of Kabbalah and so on, but just basically in terms of the Nimshal, where he stops, we'll stop too, is that the Ramchal says the fundament is the following. We've spoken before that when the Baruch Shem created the Bria as such, that the Bria as it was created exists on a number of different planes, and we've called them what's called existential planes. Fundamentally, you find with the lashon that would be used is that these different planes or different olamas, that's what they call, would be different in kedusha, or in a different in kedusha in terms of the subtlety of their aura. We've said this a number of times. That our existence as such is different from other existences. In what way? In the beginning, when the Baruch Shem first created the Bria, there was a very serious problem that the Baruch Shem had in that sense, Kaviyachol, in terms of creation itself. Why? And very briefly, what we said a long time ago is that the unique quality about the Baruch Shem, specifically the Ein Sof, the Baruch Shem Ba'atzmusai as he is that the Baruch Shem is synonymous or identical with his existence. Now, I'm not going to be myrich on what whole thing, but what we said a long time ago is that the Baruch Shem is pure existence itself. The Baruch Shem is not an entity which exists. You see, a certain type of essence which possesses existence, and we put the two together in that sense. The Baruch Shem does not possess existence. Rather, the Baruch Shem is existence in the sense that he and his existence are one and the same. There's an achdus there. There's an incredible achdus where the Baruch Shem is his existence. He is his existence, and his existence is him. Which means that fundamentally no lashon can describe him, no word or no sentence. Because the sentence God is an absolute sheker, it's false. Why? Because when we say God is, we're saying God, the essence of God, meaning that he's omniscient, omnipotent, he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and so on and so forth, is. He exists, he possesses existence. This is not true. The Baruch Shem does not possess existence. He is the thing itself. We cannot be teifes, that kind of entity. It's beyond, Lamaila, you see, it's beyond our musug of a sentence, it's beyond our musug of a word. So therefore, when the Baruch Shem wanted to create reality as we know it, there was fundamentally a very big problem. What was the problem? The problem was this, is that existence to the Baruch Shem is himself. Existence in the time of the Ein Sof is Elokus. The type of existence which was then is Elokus itself. So if the Baruch Shem wants to make something else, he has to create a new kind of existence that never existed before. You see, he has to create the notion of existence without Elokus, which is a staggering thing. How the Baruch Shem did this is incredible. I mean, because what the Baruch Shem essentially had to do was literally separate from himself in a certain aspect, you see, which is an amazing thing how you do that, because the problem of Shlita over there. You see, now fundamentally this terminology, this is called Tzimtzum, and fundamentally the most staggering thing in all creation was the fact that the Baruch Shem created existence, or a type of existence which is not divine, which is not Elokim. You see, it doesn't have Elokim in it, although in some way it relates to Elokim, you see, but it is not an Elokim. In Kabbalah they refer to that as the Cholol, you see, but we're not going to go into that. Just basically the essential concept is that the Baruch Shem created existence which is not divine. He had to separate from his own existence as such, you see, because existence before that time was him. And after that, there has to be an existence which is not him. Once that existence was established, what does that mean, that existence was established? And here's the important thing of it, the very important thing. Existence that was made by the Bnei Shalom, what's known as a nivra, having been established after his type of existence, you see, which we cannot know of, we can only know ours, is a very strange thing. That existence means that it manifests itself through substance. Everything which exists in substance, in something. It exists through something. That's called substance. Everything from the Bnei Shalom on, from the Bnei Shalom down, exists in substance. That's the essence of a nivra. The Bnei Shalom does not exist in substance, since it's pure existence itself is the expression of existence itself. We possess existence, so we exist in substance. But that substance varies. It varies by a certain qualitative fashion in terms of how powerful that substance or how close that substance is to pure existence itself. You see, that distinguishes 4 or 5, once to be 5 existential planes. That means that existence itself, once it was established as non-divine, went through 5 different stages, and each stage is an existence which exists through substance, and thus it was all the same. It's always a nivra, but its substance differs. Not the existence, it's the substance which differs, and therefore it's the quality of that existence which is different from each different plane. So there are 5 existential levels, 5 existential planes, or 5 worlds, or ilamas. And in Kabbalah, with the Ramchal says in Kabbalah, using the terms of the mashal, they're referred to going from top down as the Olam Adam Kadmoin, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. Those are the 5 levels of substance distinction in terms of that. But remember, what they all have in common is that they are all aspects of existence which is not divine. That's very critical. This, the very important thing to understand from this is a very important thing, is that somebody who is on the Olam of the Adam Kadmoin has as much shaykhus to the Bnei Shalom as someone who's on the Olam Asiya, which is absolutely nothing. Because the bridge between the infinite to the finite is itself infinite, and nothing can transcend that, no matter what degree or what kedusha you have. With that basic hakdama, we go on, and fundamentally a person is composed in his essence, or in his basic inner substance, of a piece of all these 5 worlds. The person's neshama, which is the inner pneumius of himself, what is a person? A person fundamentally is a composition of 2 different types of substances, basically. There is nothing else in the Bria which is a multiple in this way. Everything in the Bria is a homogeneous body. It's composed of one type of substance. For example, malachim. Malachim are composed of a certain type of substance. For example, most malachim exist on the Olam Yitzira, which is a certain level of a certain level of substance. All malachim in that world possess the substance of that world. They don't possess the substance of another world.